Good afternoon. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. And on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, it's a pleasure to welcome you virtually to our historic building for today's program. And how appropriate is it that the one-time home of our 32nd President, Franklin D. Roosevelt, should host a discussion on the first 100 days of his successor, the 45th President, Joe Biden. For it was Franklin Roosevelt who, in a sense, invented the notion of the first 100 days, or at least it was invented in his behalf or during his time. And as we know, in FDR's case, the first 100 days inspired an avalanche of legislation designed to lift America from the depths of the Great Depression, and against which presidents and their earliest weeks in office have been measured ever since. Of course, it's something somewhat contrived. The Washington Post wrote yesterday that the first 100 days is a hallmark holiday for the political press. But we know President Biden and the White House took it very seriously, and this afternoon, so will we. It's also worth noting that the foundational elements of the New Deal, FDR's first 100 days in office, were actually crafted at Roosevelt House, which served as the transition headquarters for Roosevelt between November 1932 and March 1933, when he went to Washington to be inaugurated, with advisors and future cabinet members like Harry Hopkins and Henry Morgenthau and Francis Perkins all gathering in our East 65th Street townhouse to hammer out these historic programs. Okay, pride of place accounted for. So we meet tonight, 90 years after FDR's presidency, 100 days after Joe Biden's inauguration, and one evening after Joe Biden's first speech to a joint session of Congress. All of those behind him, all of those now part of history as well. And we're really proud that Roosevelt House may be the first in the Academy to offer expert commentary to the public on the 100 days, not the casual and sometimes breathless chat we get on cable news, but informed scholarly analysis by our own political science experts and some very learned guests. They're here ready to parse Joe Biden's first 100 days, achievements, and shortcomings alike, both domestically and in foreign policy. So let's get to it. Let me introduce our participants. First, we welcome Peter Beinart, professor of journalism at CUNY's Craig Newmark's Graduate School of Journalism and a professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's also an editor at large at Jewish Currents, writes the Beinart Notebook on Substack.com, and contributes to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, FT, The Atlantic, and other publications. He's a former editor of the New Republic, and his books include The Good Fight, The Icarus Syndrome, and The Crisis of Zionism. We welcome Jacqueline Braveboy Wagner, professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center and in the Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership at City College. She specializes in foreign policy, diplomacy, and global development with an emphasis on small states and the global South. She's authored or edited 11 books, including the Historical Dictionary of U.S. Caribbean Relations and Small States in Global Affairs, the Foreign Policies of the Caribbean Community. She also serves as contributing editor to the Library of Congress's Latin American Studies Handbook. We welcome David R. Jones, professor of political science at Baruch College and the CUNY Graduate Center. His research on Congress, political parties, and elections has been published in a number of scholarly journals, and he's the author of Political Parties and Policy Gridlock in American Government, and co-author of Americans, Congress, and Democratic Responsiveness, Public Evaluations of Congress and electoral consequences. He's regularly served as well as an exit poll analyst for CBS News and the New York Times. And Leslie McCall, Associate Director of the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she is also Presidential Professor of Sociology and Political Science. She studies public opinion on inequality and opportunity and is the author of The Undeserving Rich: American Beliefs About Inequality, Opportunity, and Redistribution, and Complex Inequality: Gender, Class, and Race in the New Economy. She's also published in a wide range of journals and edited volumes. Our moderator tonight, we're happy to say, is our own Charles Tien, Professor of Political Science at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. A Fulbright Scholar, he is the current editor of Polity, the Journal of the Northeast Political Science Association. His research interests are in legislative behavior, race and ethnic politics, voting behavior, and election forecasting. Charles has led or appeared on several Roosevelt House programs over the years, including two memorable events at which he forecast the 2016 and the 2020 presidential elections. And we are very glad to have him back with us tonight and grateful that he has organized this timely expert panel. We're all eager to hear insights from all of you. So with that, let me hand the mic over to Professor Charles Tien.
Thank you for that introduction, Harold. I want to thank President Jennifer Rabb for her support for today's panel. And Harold and the entire team at Roosevelt House also deserves thanks and credit for making everything run smoothly today. And I also want to thank the chairs of political science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, Zachary Shirky and Allison Cole, for co-sponsoring today's event. As Harold was saying, it was right about 90 years ago that FDR's first 100 days led to this now seemingly right 4-year event where we sit down, at least the political class does, and evaluates the new administration. And so we have assembled 4 experts today, and each will speak about 10 minutes on different topics ranging from inequality, racial, gender, and income inequality, Biden's legislative strategy, and his foreign policy. And so for those in the audience, thank you for coming today. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to all the questions at the end of all of the presentations. So to me, President Biden's speech last night seemed to be the most attention he has sought and received since being inaugurated. He seems to be flying under the radar, and by comparison to his direct predecessor, he has made the presidency and politics boring again, it seems, to the relief of many, I think. Professor Jones, what has President Biden's political and legislative strategy been, and what does his first 100 days tell us, if anything, about the rest of his term?
Thanks, Charles. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. Let me begin by noting that a president's first 100 days are not really a good means for assessing what the rest of his term will be like in terms of legislative success. But what we can learn during a president's first 100 days is about his policy priorities and his strategy. Now, my distinguished colleagues in this panel are better able to speak to the policy aspect. I'm going to be focusing primarily on what we've learned about Biden's strategic approach. Strategy is important because research shows that while the political environment is the best predictor of presidential success, individual presidents can take either more or less strategic advantage of the opportunities that they face. So here I want to touch on strategic choices that the Biden administration has made in 3 general areas: the tone of his politics, partisan or bipartisan, the format of his policy delivery, and the sequence of his policy rollout. So let's start with the tone of the Biden administration. The average American prefers policies that are ideologically moderate. However, Americans aren't very sophisticated in determining how moderate or extreme the content of a piece of legislation is. Rather than studying up on the pros and cons of a bill, Americans tend to use simplified cues to help decide if legislation is moderate or extreme. The one important cue that Americans use is the degree of partisan conflict surrounding a piece of legislation. If they perceive a low partisan conflict on a bill, they assume that the bill must be reasonable in its content. So one strategy that a president can use to project the reasonableness of his legislative proposals is to tailor their content to be more moderate in an effort to garner bipartisan support in Congress. So for example, Obama's stimulus bill in 2009 was an intentionally pared down in size and loaded with substantial tax cuts in an attempt to woo support from Republicans. Now, this effort largely failed, mainly because Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell specifically wanted to deny Obama the benefit of any bipartisan optics. So in contrast, Biden appears to me to have learned from Obama's mistake of taking his own campaign rhetoric about bipartisanship literally. So contrary to the fears of many Democrats, Biden seems to be more of a realist than an idealist regarding the prospects for substantive congressional bipartisanship. He knows that no matter how moderate the content of his proposals, he will not get any bipartisan support in Congress. Instead, Biden's focus has been on projecting reasonableness, not by watering down his policy content, but rather by minimizing the degree to which partisan conflict dominates the news cycle. And this is being accomplished in two ways. First, regardless of the content of his legislative proposals, Biden remains committed to unifying rhetoric and bipartisan gestures. As an illustration, recall that Biden invited Republican members of Congress to the White House to discuss the COVID relief bill, bipartisan optics, but then did not hesitate to push ahead his own version of the bill without their support. His address to Congress last night also was a good example, replete with rhetorical references to unity and bipartisanship. Second, as Charles just alluded to, Biden has intentionally maintained a low public profile. Now, politics is inherently conflictual, and the president commands the most press attention of anyone in politics. So with fewer presidential statements, there's less politics in the news, and less politics in the news means the public is perceiving less conflict in Washington. As an example, note that Biden avoided publicly chastising Republicans for failing to support the COVID relief bill. Doing so merely would have drawn attention to the lack of bipartisan support. All right, so second, I want to talk briefly about the format of the Biden administration's policy delivery and his strategy in that area. It's a well-known psychological phenomenon that when something good happens to a person, our default reaction is to ascribe responsibility to ourselves rather than the actual cause. So this is partly why rising employment numbers in and of themselves rarely boost public approval of presidents. Citizens say to themselves, I got this job, the government didn't get it for me. In order for government officials to get public credit for their policies, it's not enough just that the policy works. Rather, the key is the degree to which the benefits of that policy are traceable back to the government. An important factor determining the degree of traceability is the format of a policy's delivery. Now, in 2009, Obama's stimulus package was criticized by Democrats because the beneficiaries were only minimally aware that they were actually benefiting from that package. And one reason was that many of the benefits came in the form of one-time tax credits that were largely invisible to most Americans, except perhaps during tax season. Again, the Biden administration seems to have learned from the mistakes of the Obama administration. Biden's policy team is deliberately changing the way that economic policy is delivered in order to make its benefits more visible. Consider the COVID relief bill's child tax credit. Instead of a lump sum credit at tax time, the bill was written to produce monthly government checks, in essence, a repeated reminder of the tangible help from the federal government. And the intentionality of this change in delivery strategy can be seen in Biden's remarks after Senate passage of the COVID bill. he highlighted that ordinary Americans will, quote, be able to see and know and feel the changes in their own lives, end quote. So this is clearly intentional. Finally, a brief word about the sequence of the Biden administration's policy rollout and the strategy they're employing there. Presidents tend to be more legislatively successful when they are more popular. In a sense, presidential popularity is a form of political capital. But a president's approval ratings are not fixed at a set level. Rather, public approval often wanes throughout a president's term, dropping more steeply when he pushes for agenda items that are less popular among the public. So given these dynamics, the sequence and timing of a president's policy rollout is an important strategic consideration. On the one hand, the president could decide to spend this political capital quickly in order to help pass controversial policy programs that need help getting across the goal line. However, using this capital for less popular ends will deplete it more quickly as the public becomes frustrated that the president's priorities don't closely match their own. Alternatively, a president could try to extend the amount of time which he possesses political capital by prioritizing legislation that's already popular and thereby lessening the chance that the public begins to sour on him quickly. It could be said that in 2017, President Trump chose the first route. Specifically, he wasted his first 6 months focusing his legislative agenda on a failed effort to repeal Obamacare, a policy on which a majority of Americans prefer the status quo. In contrast, Biden appears to be choosing the second route. Surveys show that the number one issue for Americans is not climate change or guns or police reform or election reform, but COVID. And coming in a close second is the economy and jobs. So that's why I think Biden has prioritized the COVID bill first, and then two jobs-related bills, his infrastructure and family plans, next. Even though other issues unexpectedly bubbled up in the news during the first 100 days, guns, police reform come to mind. The Biden administration has refused to get sidetracked. It knows that the public does not view these issues as priorities, and also it knows that these are more contentious issues. Thinking back to point number one about bipartisanship, to the extent that these other issues are in the news, the attendant partisan conflict will be to the detriment of Biden's approval ratings. The intentionality of Biden's strategic sequencing, I think, became quite apparent during the Biden press conference on March 25th. In a series of extended comments to reporters, Biden stated, quote, "Successful presidents before me, they're successful because they know how to time what they're doing." And in another exchange, he elaborated, quote, "The most urgent problem facing American people, I stated from the outset, was COVID-19 and the economic dislocation for millions and millions of Americans. And so that's what I put all my focus on in the beginning, dealing with those particular problems. The other problems we're talking about, from immigration to guns to other things, are long-term problems. They've been around a long time. And what we're going to be able to do, God willing, is now begin one at a time to focus on those as well. End quote. So we'll see if he actually gets to those issues, but they're clearly not a priority. Let me conclude by noting that when we think about Joe Biden, we often think first about his stereotype as a gaffe-prone, shoot-from-the-hip politician. So some in the audience today might be surprised by my suggestion that Biden is running his executive branch as a disciplined, strategic operation. But if we think about it more carefully, it shouldn't be that surprising. After all, Biden is the first Washington insider to assume the presidency in more than 3 decades. He came into office with 44 years of prior public service. This is the most government service of any US president ever. Still, an important caveat's in order. Experience is no guarantee of success. Prior to Joe Biden, the US president with the most government experience is James Buchanan. Now, Buchanan is widely regarded as one of the worst presidents the nation ever had, having helped fumble the nation into a civil war. So hopefully that particular aspect of history will not repeat itself. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, David. Professor McCall, I'm sure you've been watching Biden closely on his proposals to address inequality in all areas. What can you tell us about Biden's actions and proposals to tackle gross inequalities in America today.
Hey, thanks very much, Charles, and also to the Roosevelt House for organizing this, this event. Well, to talk about inequality and domestic policy is kind of a tall order, given that there have been a lot of proposals, and David mentioned some of them in his remarks. What I want to do is to begin with a few words about what I think are some of the background factors that are motivating the Biden administration's domestic policies, which include the COVID, the latest COVID-19 relief bill, again, that David mentioned, as well as the American Jobs Plan, which is the infrastructure plan, and then just recently this week, the American Family Plan, which I will talk a little bit more about, but you can kind of think about the American Family Plan as, in a sense, an extension of the American Rescue Plan, which was the COVID-19 relief bill, an extension and expansion of that. Now, clearly, the background factors that, that are creating the kind of pressure for Biden to act on COVID, on the economy, those are very clear, as David mentioned. I would say that the other really top priorities in the administration and that have been made clear through public protests, perhaps if not through sort of most important problem polls, would be sort of entrenched racial injustice and inequality, as well as the climate crisis. So those are kind of the immediate pressures I see on Biden. But what I want to talk about a little bit more are the longer term pressures. And I think these longer term pressures are what are shaping the particular character and especially the scope and scale of the administration's domestic policy. So let me just run through what I think are a few of these really key long-term trends. First, just let's begin with median household income. Let's just think of this as a middle-class income. So median household income has been stagnant for the past 20 years. The previous peak was in the late 1990s. And then there were increases in median household income, middle-class income in the 80s, in the 90s, and it just stopped flat in the late 1990s. There were indications that median household income was starting to tick up again to match the late 1990s peak in 2018 and 2019. And then, of course, came the pandemic. So still, I would say overall stagnation over the past 20 years. Second, and related, substantial deep racial gaps in income, that is gaps in median income among racial and ethnic groups. For example, the Black-white median household income gap is large and also has not changed since 1970. So for 50 years, we've seen the same gap, and this is generally true across racial and ethnic groups. If anything, the Black-white income gap has actually expanded somewhat in the past 10 years. Thirdly, female labor force participation rates also plateaued in the late 1990s. And many think that this is one of the reasons why family income, household income has stagnated, because women have not been able to add hours to the family income, hours of work, to increase the income of families. Men's wages generally have been stagnant for much longer than the past 20 years. Women's wages are now stagnant over the past 20 years, as well as their labor force participation. At the same time that all of this is happening, major costs have been rising, most especially for healthcare, for education, for housing. And finally, most American households don't have a financial cushion to fall back on. The lower half of American households own only 1% of the nation's total wealth. And the top decile of the nation holds 75% of the nation's wealth. And wealth is extremely critical in a crisis, right? This is what many people have been talking about. Many observers have been talking about for a long time, that there's just simply no financial cushion in the event of a crisis. And then, of course, this crisis did occur. So in short, the majority of Americans, incomes are in long-term stagnation. Women have not been able to increase their hours over the past 2 decades, primarily people speculate because of the lack of affordable childcare options. Racial inequalities are large and entrenched, and most American families don't have wealth and savings to fall back on in a crisis. And I would say these are the main factors that made the pandemic more devastating than it should have been. And they're also, I think, the factors that are behind the need for a complete overhaul of the social safety net. So if people don't have wealth to rely on as their social safety net, then they need public programs and policies and benefits to do so. I think this is the impetus, not just of the crisis, but of the long term, not just of the pandemic crisis, but of the long-term economic and racial crisis. What has happened? What are these proposals? I'm not sure that I have time to go into the nitty-gritty details, but I will try to do a little bit of that. So I would say these proposals are really span the spectrum of social safety net policies, mainly because though all of those different types of policies are needed, but at this particular moment. But let's put them into two buckets. One is social insurance. So most of the policies that, that Biden is advocating in these three packages, the American Rescue Plan in particular, and the American Families Plan, but also to a less extent, the American Jobs Plan, are social insurance policies. These are policies in which individuals pool income through taxes that are then paid out during periods of risk, mainly during periods of income loss due to illness, which was obviously a factor during the coronavirus, injury, old age, unemployment, loss of jobs, another huge issue during the coronavirus crisis, family care, that is parents come out of the labor force and lose income when they need to care for a family member. Another really critical piece that came to light during the pandemic. Those are social insurance policies, and Biden has expanded pretty much all of these types of policies and is trying to lock those expansions in for the long term in the American Family Plan, which is the latest plan that he has put forward this week. There is also a set of policies that are called social services or social investment policies. These are investments in the human infrastructure of the country, and really essentially these are education policies. And these policies also connect to criminal justice reform in important ways, which activists have called for a shift from punishment to social and financial supports and high quality educational and employment opportunities. You know, most Americans, I think this might be compatible with what David was saying, but I would say most Americans are what is called pragmatically liberal. They may be sort of in principle conservative and anti-government, but they tend to very much support in high numbers these kinds of pragmatic policies that help people out in situations that are not under their own control, right? Aging, illness, job loss, recessions, family care. And so these, again, are very popular sorts of policies. Specifically, the American Family Plan is extending some of the key new provisions that were in the American Rescue Plan. That was the COVID-19 relief package. Specifically, the child tax credit that David mentioned got a lot of attention because of the characteristics that David mentioned. But the American Family Plan is now trying to extend that, make that permanent at least until 2025, also including paid family leave, universal pre-K, and universal community college, 2 years of community college, or at least near universal. There's some debate over this universality, but we're talking about the overwhelming majority of families. If there's an income cap, the income cap is at about 100,000, anywhere between kind of 75,000 and 150,000 of family income is the cap to qualify for these policies. The universality, I would argue, for almost all of these policies speaks to the widespread need. These are problems that have been experienced by the broad swath of the middle class and lower income and poor Americans in the country, and thus the demand is very high from the public. I don't have time to talk so much about the other really huge proposal that's been put forward, unfortunately, and it's much more about the fixing the labor market, structural problems in the labor market that simultaneously address climate change and racial inequities. This is the industrial policy that's put forward in the infrastructure bill, and that is also more or less along the lines of the Green New Deal. In all of these policies, Biden, there aren't very many details on this, but he has stressed that each of these policies are going to entail high wage, high benefit, unionized jobs. We don't know how that's going to occur, but this is something that he continually emphasizes. So this is where we really get at changing the source of income, right? They're these stagnating incomes. How do we change that? How do we grow incomes again? Well, it's through wages. It's through increasing wages for the majority of workers. And Biden is certainly putting a large emphasis, not just on creating jobs, but creating jobs that will lift incomes and lift specifically incomes of those groups that have fallen behind the most during this past period of 20 or 30 years. I wanted to say something about the political, what is needed. I'm just going to say one thing. I know I need to close up here about what politics have enabled this. And I'll just say that what I find really interesting about Biden's approach to bipartisanship, and this is going to piggyback a little bit off of what David said, is that he's now saying that these policies are bipartisan because they have bipartisan public support. I think this is really important, a really important message. I think it's true. I think it's framing, but I also think it's true. They really do have bipartisan public support, even if they don't have bipartisan congressional support. So I think I'll close there.
Thanks for those comments, Leslie. I look forward to the Q&A when I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. We're going to turn to foreign policy now. President Biden, as David mentioned, right, a longtime government servant. So he has a long history working in American foreign policy and spent a significant portion of his address last night talking about America's challenges abroad. Professor Bravebohr-Wagner, what do you think of Biden's foreign policy so far? And is there a Biden doctrine beginning to take shape?
Thank you, Charles. And glad to be here. And I'm going to try to say this as briefly as possible, but do forgive me if it's a little long, okay? I don't think that 3 months is any time to give a president to shine, to make a mark in foreign policy. I think it's more possible in domestic policy, following the pattern of FDR. But foreign policy is something which has a large amount of continuity in general. And I think that especially in terms of Mr. Biden, who is confronting so many issues, COVID-19, the economic problems, and on top of that, a previous administration that moved away from what's considered the normal US foreign policy. So I think there's a little bit much to ask him to score an A, right, on foreign policy at this point in time. Last night, I thought he gave a great speech and he touched on issues of foreign policy. I didn't expect him to. I thought it would be domestically oriented. But I think it is important that what he understands is the connection between foreign policy and domestic policy. I think he understands this so very well. And especially when it comes to our role in the world, our ability to exercise what we call soft power in the world, meaning not military power, but shine in other ways. And I think he really understands that. And he tries to encapsulate it in something called a foreign policy for the middle class. I don't particularly like that formulation, because foreign policy should be for everyone, not just for the middle class. I think economic policy can be pursued for the middle class, but foreign policy is for everyone. So I would argue about that particular formulation, but I think that the intent is really to move us back from a policy that may have been a little less understood by the vast majority of people at home. So yeah, I went back as you assigned this to me, sort of, and I went back and I thought, you know, my biggest disappointment in the elections was that there was so little discussed on foreign policy. When you looked at these numerous debates, I kept saying, a foreign policy question, please, right? And there was hardly anything. You'd have a few sound bites, which would be about Russia and China in particular, but very little that really could tell us what he intended to do. So fortunately, I even wrote the campaign to ask for some documentation, and then we got a lot of documentation which actually told us what the administration was trying to do. And so as I made some notes about it, these were some of the points, right? Strengthen democracy at home and abroad, restore our moral leadership, and a focus on immigration was involved there. I'm not sure that it fitted in there, but it was in there. Defend vital interests via a strong military only to be used as a last resort. End forever wars, elevate diplomacy, strengthen partnerships, support Israel's security, rejoin the JCPOA, strengthen it and extend it, jumpstart the North Korea process in collaboration with the allies, pursue an extension of New START, and rejoin the Paris Accord. That's just the major points that we could get out of the documentation. And in the first 100 days, it is it is a good start, in that a seasoned diplomatic team was put in place, and most of us were very happy that these were people who had quite a lot of experience in the State Department and elsewhere. I especially have to give a prop to the UN rep, who is, as you know, a career diplomat and a minority person. There were immigration changes, obviously, things which I might touch on later, but which are normally seen in a domestic, more in a domestic sense. Outreach to allies has occurred. The beginnings of negotiation on the JCPO, right, have happened. An announcement about restarting New START was made very early on. The Paris Accord was rejoined, and boots on the ground are going to be removed in the forever war of Afghanistan. I'm not going to go into all of that. I would just mention two things about one about Afghanistan and one about the JCPOA. It is impossible to really comment now on what's going to happen with the JCPOA, simply because the negotiations have just begun, and what seems to be on the table right now is two opposing positions, which one of which is for Iran to go back to where it was before in terms of its nuclear enrichment, and the other one is our having to remove sanctions on Iran. And how those two things are going to play out, right, very difficult. My own view is that, in a way, Iran has an important point to make in saying that they did not leave the JCPOA. That was the US that did that, so the US has to make some concessions. But that's too early to make any real comment about. The other thing is the forever war in Afghanistan, and we're getting out of it, and I think that that not too much can be said about it, and I'm sure it has great domestic support. We do need to get out of a situation where you've been bogged down for so many years, and certainly I believe, as a global South person, right, I believe that local solutions for local problems as much as possible. So these sides need to come together and to make some approaches there. The other thing I quickly wanted to mention was the New START. It was great to see this decision to engage again, engage again on nuclear issues. The problem was that there are some things that I just call things that can't wait. And the thing that couldn't wait in terms of our relationship with Russia was the report on Russian interference, which then meant that this carrot and stick approach has been put in place, which is we want to sanction, right, Russia as much as possible, but at the same time, we want them to cooperate on New START. And in fact, I see that as a kind of a strategic approach which is developing under Biden, in the Biden administration. It's what we call coercive diplomacy in foreign policy, which means that you use carrots and sticks as much as possible. You cooperate on some issues, and then you and you argue on other issues. So I'm not sure how that will work out. The other things that one could talk about in the 100 days were specific things that have not been done. As a Caribbean and Latin American person, we are quite disappointed and quite anxious in the region to hear about policies, specific policies towards Venezuela and Cuba. Venezuela, the outflow of refugees into Latin American and Caribbean countries has become quite intolerable. In Cuba's case, there's Mr. Obama's opening. The Cuban people are certainly suffering from the additional sanctions that were the reversal that was put in place by Mr. Trump. And so one would definitely like to see some decision there, but that is also tied in very much with domestic politics and what is going on with the Miami, and Floridian Cubans. So, so I guess we'll have a better idea about that later. I also noticed that not much has been said about the Arab-Israeli situation. We have had some other issues in the Middle East, but I think that Peter is the person who could probably speak better about what's going on in terms of the relationship with Israel and with Bibi and Netanyahu. All right, I don't have a clear picture of what Biden intends in terms of the two-state solution. On other Middle East issues, I was going to comment very briefly on the fact that the administration moved quite quickly to remove support for the Saudis, right, in the Yemen war. But I do feel that has come late in the game, in that the UAE had already pulled out of the fighting, and from what I have gathered in my few visits to Saudi Arabia, I think the idea there had already been that we would seek some sort of negotiated solution. So it may be a little late, but I think that is better late than never, and that it may push the sides to get together and find a solution depending on what Iran does. So those are the things that I wanted to say a little bit about. But I really wanted to concentrate on something else, and so I'll spend the next 5 minutes or whatever talking about Mr. Biden's big ideas, because I am very surprised to find that Mr. Biden is a big idea person. Granted that we clearly needed to get back on the global stage after the Trump administration, which was much more somewhat isolationist, more along the lines of everybody do whatever you want and leave us alone. But this big idea of Biden is clearly to restore the US as a global leader. And to do that, he is anxious to form partnerships with a lot of allies, right? A lot of countries. And that is based on their democracy. So the overarching umbrella that I see in his foreign policy is this determination to restore America's global leadership and its soft power. I think if an NSS document is being prepared, that would be central, which is that we go back to the tradition of liberal global leadership, which has happened since World War too. What does bother me a little bit about the policy is that it's being placed. It's a little different from the policies that we had in the past, in that there's a heavy stress on democracy vis-a-vis autocracy, forming a coalition of nations committed to democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. It sounds perfectly fine, but in theory, those things are very difficult to use as a basis for foreign policy. President Carter tried to use human rights as a centerpiece of his foreign policy. It didn't work. He ended up having to include some countries that were not quite, that democratic, right, or that respecters of human rights. He had to, basically adjust that so that we could meet our national interests. So I have a little problem with seeing autocracies as enemies, in that it doesn't leave room for those countries that really are somewhere in the middle. And I think, again, if I may bring up something like, like Saudi Arabia ranks high in my work, but it doesn't rank that high. But I'm simply, again, thinking about countries like Saudi Arabia. Once the report on the killing of Jamal Khashoggi came out, we had to make a stance. And the stance, for a moment there was a bit of nervousness among many foreign policy people as to whether the whole autocracy thing would come ahead of strategic good relations with a strategic ally, and it turns out that Biden ended up in a very moderate compromise, placing sanctions on a large number of people, 76 people, including some family members, and that's really big in the Saudi sense. But not actually sanctioning the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. And this has enabled both sides to continue to cooperate on Iranian aggression, which is happening all the time in Saudi Arabia. So from that point of view, I think there's a balance in terms of what Biden, a sort of moderation in terms of what he wants. But he is out there trying to promote this like-minded coalition of states. And in the first 3 months, I would simply say, there's been quite a lot. There's an energetic outreach virtually and in person to individual countries and regions. The Europeans, of course, and Canada, because that's your basis, but Asia. And I think Asia is reacting quite happily to this pivot, as a pivot to Asia. I don't know how long it will last, because the pivot to Biden didn't last. And it's being framed in terms of Indo-Pacific, which is a sort of a newer designation. And it involves a relationship, for example, with the Quad, as they are called, China, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. It also involves, of course, relations with ASEAN. And the only thing is that when I speak about this to Southeast Asian colleagues, they warn that the Quad has little substance, and has been a coalition has been revived by Mr. Trump in 2017, but that they have very mixed feelings about whether it can work. This combination of India and Australia and so on. There are a lot of geopolitical problems. There has been no Asian-wide statement coming from the Biden administration, but it is interesting that on the Myanmar issue, which comes under things I call things that won't wait, the Biden team has strongly expressed its displeasure, but is allowing ASEAN nations to have some room for local approaches and local solutions. And finally, on this matter, I see Africa finally getting some attention again, and this is great. A special envoy is to be appointed to the Horn. Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa were invited to the climate conference. This is good, and I think perhaps along the line, Mr. Biden will articulate some kind of a common policy, the African nations usually are very open to the type of broad policy as Clinton had with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or President Bush had with PEPFAR, right, which dealt with HIV. So the very quickly, because I don't very quickly, I think that the climate change conference that was recently held is part of this big idea. It was his first foray on the big stage, and it's something that's close to his heart. Climate change, it may not be as important domestically as my colleagues have said, but it's very important internationally. I am old enough to have seen, the changes in countries out there in terms of their initial ideas that this and environmentalism as a whole was a concoction of the developed countries, and now everybody's experiencing the floods and the droughts and the sea level rises and so on and so forth, and everybody seems to be committed in some way to this. The one issue, and here I always have a critique, I guess, is that inviting 40 leaders to talk is more of a US showcase than a really serious set of, of negotiation, despite the fact that the US came with a big pledge to cut emissions by 50% and by 2030. This is great. Many countries made no pledges, and there was the usual backtracking when it came to who's going to pay for what. Mr. Bolsonaro in particular, of course, had a proposal that he wanted $1 billion in order to avoid to put in place plans to avoid Amazon deforestation. The problem with that, and I was getting feedback from people in my own region of the world, and it is, how do you choose your 40 countries? Does this mean that these are the favored 40 countries? And why does the US always do that in a kind of divide and rule situation? Are we not democratic enough, or are we not committed enough to be invited to this US meeting? So there was a lot of quite a bit of grumpiness in terms of that, and I think that this sort of puts a bit of a negative on those kinds of approaches. The one idea to finish off with, right, is infrastructure. The infrastructure proposal looks like it's domestic, but there is an international or foreign policy strategy, and that is to oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative. It has been a hugely popular initiative in the global South. China gives aid on soft terms and so on, and China is giving aid in infrastructure, right? Began with the Silk Road, and then it's all over, including in Latin America and the Caribbean. The point about that is that unless the United States, which is coming late to the game, improves its own infrastructure and moves toward boosting a program which is already in place called the Clean Network, right, which is an attempt to make countries move away from China on privacy issues and to move towards other things. And yet, despite the Clean Network, I happen to be in a fairly sensitive place, right, government-wise, and there was a Huawei modem being used by in a very sensitive situation. So it's obvious that this thrust to make government workers, etc., not use Chinese technology is not quite working. Absolutely last, right? COVID-19. I'm glad that that wonderful things have happened domestically, that we all have vaccines. But when it comes to inequality, it bothers me because it also affects trade policy and so on, where we're seeing yet last night a lot of talk about America first, American made in America, etc. And there's a hint of protectionism, which is anti-globalization, and which just leads down the line to retaliatory tariffs and so on. And this in the vaccine nationalism that we saw with the United States, I think was problematic. Most countries have to rely on COVAX, the World Health Organization facility. And India and China were out there boasting about the vaccines that they were giving to everybody. It was, you couldn't open your WhatsApp without getting some of these things. And yet the United States never thought, kept on hoarding its vaccines and did not try to help until very recently when, of course, it has now agreed to release the vaccines. So this protectionism and this inequality, and I would say there's an element there, that may bother a number of leaders out there in terms of trying to appraise what's happening. So that's all I will say. I would say that in terms of most of this, I gave Mr. Biden A- because I like to rank, I'm a professor after all, so, A's and B's and C's. I gave him A-, I give him B's. I added a little bit of, well, I don't know what he will do. I don't know what he will do, for example, on immigration. For me, the immigration element that is most important is going to Central America and trying to deal with these things at the source, because we in the Caribbean who experience the same things that Central Americans, the weather problems and the guns and the gang violence and so on, you need to deal with it at the source. And there's a program on citizen security that the United States has run for quite a long time. It obviously has not worked. This is the program that Mr. Biden talks about. He talks about having been responsible for $750 million, in aid for citizen security in Central America. Hasn't worked. I am happy to see that Kamala, is going to be going down and be in charge of working out some arrangement from at the source, as we say, but not quite sure that the money, since it didn't work the first time around, that pouring money into Central America will work without great oversight. So A- to B+ for Mr. Biden. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Jackie, for those thoughts on Biden's policies around the world. What I'm reminded of when I heard your comments is how interconnected domestic policy and foreign policy seem to be. And I know Professor Beinart wants to talk about the differences between Biden's domestic and foreign policy so far. Leslie talked about some of the proposals, that Biden has put forth domestically, and I think most progressives are happy with the domestic proposals, and they've totaled over $6 trillion. What surprised me was not the scope of the proposals, but the fact that Republicans countered with actually more than $1 trillion of spending proposals of their own, after spending $3 trillion in the previous administration. And so my thought was, well, maybe the Reagan era is over and we are entering into a progressive era. I don't know, but certainly, Biden has been more progressive in his domestic policies than most expected, and less so in his foreign policy. And Professor Beinart, how do you evaluate Biden's foreign policy in those terms in his first 100 days?
Thanks. And for anyone's interested, just in a self-promotional vein, I'm just going to put the link to my newsletter in the chat. Look, I think if people who work on domestic policy are excited that Biden bears resemblances to Lyndon Johnson, I guess to be flip, I would say I think the worry is that I think he bears some on foreign policy as well, or some combination of Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman, which is to say, This is I think that you have to go back to Johnson to find a Democratic president for whom there has been as large a gap between how progressive his foreign policy is and how progressive his domestic policy is and how hawkish his foreign policy is. And I think that speaks to the moment that we're in. We're in an era of domestic progressive activism, and that it is that, I think, more than anything, that has pushed Biden outside of the kind of Clinton or even Clinton and Obama kind of centrist perspective on a range of domestic policy issues. But with the exception of climate, we're not in such an era on foreign policy, which is mostly because we generally tend to not be, except when the country is at war. And so basically what you have is you have a foreign policy elite that is much more insulated from domestic grassroots pressure than the domestic policy elite. It's the days where you could easily appoint a secretary, top treasury officials from Goldman Sachs are gone, because the Elizabeth Warrens and the Bernie Sanders of the world will rake you over the coals, and they have been elevated by these grassroots movements going back to Occupy, Black Lives Matter. But you can still stack the Pentagon and the National Security Council and even the State Department with tons and tons of people who work for defense contractors or come from think tanks that are heavily subsidized by defense contractors, and you get very little pushback because, again, the foreign policy elite is much, much less respondent to the grassroots of the Democratic Party. There are huge discrepancies in public opinion. The grassroots of the Democratic Party is much more progressive on a whole range of issues, cutting the defense budget, for instance, which Biden has decided not to do. But they don't have, but it's not organized in the way, we haven't seen these big movements. And Bernie Sanders actually, I think, made a critical and I would say fateful decision in the summer of 2016 when he was at his moment of maximum influence over Joe Biden. You remember they created these task forces to work together on a range of issues. There was no such task force on foreign policy. And so you've seen that while Sanders and Warren have a significant amount of influence on Biden's domestic policy, they have very, very little influence. Just look at personnel. Very little influence on his domestic, very little influence on his foreign policy. The reason that I think that his foreign policy is also much more bipartisan, which I don't mean as a compliment, because the kind of foreign policy establishment in Washington has really rallied around essentially a Cold War with China. Most people don't want to use that term, but that's essentially become the driving, I would say, force among both mainstream Democrats and Republicans. You know, we can talk about how great it is that we're supposedly entering the forever war, but it's not a coincidence that we are doing so, finally getting out of Afghanistan, de-emphasizing terrorism at the moment when there is an even bigger alternative, a kind of which can maintain defense budgets at very, very high levels for the foreseeable future. And I worry, although I don't think Biden is like Lyndon Johnson in the sense that we're on the verge of another Vietnam, but I think that we are in a moment, again, a little bit like the late 40s and early 1950s and like the 1960s, where you have a very strong hawkish consensus on China and an increasing Cold War framework that is very, very, there are very, very few people in Washington who are challenging it. And Biden himself shows no inclination to challenge it whatsoever. It would have been very difficult for an American president at this moment to challenge it because Donald Trump unleashed something with his anti-China rhetoric the public opinion on American views of China have radically shifted just in the last couple of years. And so you now have this dynamic, which again, very reminiscent of the Truman administration, where you have what you might say a kind of an unreasonable kind of McCarthy-esque kind of hawkishness on the Republican Party side, often with thinly veiled racist elements. And so by comparison, we're supposed to be happy about the kind of multilateral, reasonable, pragmatic hawkishness of the Biden administration. But it's also, in my mind, very dangerous. First of all, it makes cutting the defense budget impossible. It's going to empower the national security state in ways that are going to be proven very dangerous. I mean, people have been talking rightly about this wave of anti-Asian violence. What people have not, I think, been talking nearly enough about is what the FBI has been doing on campuses across the country with these crackdowns on researchers who have any connection to China whatsoever, right? It was only a decade ago that it was considered great if you're a university to have some kind of relationship with a Chinese institution. Now you have wave after wave of people having their careers destroyed because they didn't fill out some paperwork at 10 years ago at a time when the universities were pushing them to have connections with China. And this is something that I don't believe that there is a clean, sanitized Cold War that we can take place. We are seeing a kind of hysteria and paranoia emerging, which we have seen in previous moments in American history that prove very dangerous. And what it is making it very, very difficult to do is to have a kind of far-reaching conversation, the kind of conversation that Leslie was talking about, that people are starting to have on domestic policy, where they're really challenging basic axioms of the way things have been working of government policy. This Cold War mentality is making that conversation impossible on foreign policy. It's all focused on basically maintaining American primacy in East Asia. And there are very, very few people who are talking about what the consequences of trying to do that are, right? I mean, Taiwan is 160 kilometers from mainland China. It's 8,000 kilometers from Honolulu. There's been very little the United States is moving closer and closer towards ending its one China policy and having a virtually an official relationship with Taiwan at the very moment when the military balance is tipping against us in that area. And this environment that is being created with the Biden administration's complicity, I think, is making those conversations really, really difficult. And it also, and this is my last point, it also fuels this American exceptionalist narrative, which makes a self-critical kind of foreign policy perspective very difficult. I mean, you listen to Biden folks, and they talk endlessly about the kind of us as the defenders of the liberal rules-based international order, especially when it comes to places like the South China Sea. And yet, because progressives are so weak in the foreign policy space, there's very little mainstream conversation about the enormous range of ways in which the United States is actually a great enemy of anything that one might consider a liberal or rules-based international order when it comes to our clients and our interests abroad. So I'm sorry if that's a bit negative, but I worry that this is a presidency which is on completely separate tracks on foreign policy and domestic policy. And as we saw in the 50s and 60s, that everyone says foreign policy and domestic policy are interwoven. Yeah, they're interwoven, right? And it was Vietnam and the Cold War and that in some ways brought the Great Society and the progressive era of the 60s to a crashing halt. And I worry that ultimately this Cold War with China is going to have negative impacts for the kind of shifts that Leslie's talking about on the domestic side.
Those are fascinating comments, Peter. Thank you for that. Thank you all the panelists for your comments. And the audience now has an opportunity to ask questions, and I can see from the Q&A box there are a number of them. So I will read through these and direct the questions to each of our speakers. First one, I think is directed to Leslie. Professor McCall, we have a student, I think, who's saying, can you speak about the most tangible aspects of Biden's agenda or legislative action so far, and how in terms of how they'll affect college and graduate students, right? Specifically, CUNY students.
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that I was trying to emphasize is just the scope and the scale of the proposals. And one feature of the proposals is, as I mentioned, the universalism aspect. So that there are these policies that are putting cash in the hands of individuals. Both, of course, the most obvious examples are were part of the COVID relief bills. But there were also these proposals, there are these proposals for extending the child tax credit for and making the refundability of that, which essentially creates a child care allowance. I say that not necessarily because students have children, but as an example of putting of the sort of the style of the program is to put more cash in people's hands. And on a relatively universal basis, like I said, the income caps are high for individuals, 75,000. So individuals who would be eligible for these would be 75,000, an income of $75,000 or less, or for a family would be 125,000, and so on. So that's on one side. That's on the social policy side. I think on the other side, it's just simply the expansion of education, putting more money into the educational system in a number of different ways that should shore up public universities like CUNY, and also support the movement for higher wages and unionization across the board. I think all of those kinds of sort of the supporting of the workers' movements for greater higher pay and collective bargaining rights, improved working conditions, childcare. All of these are very much sort of employment supporting policies, and specifically within the education sector, which I think should be helpful for students.
Thank you. David, I think there's a question for you, and I'm gonna edit the question and ask you to talk about the chances of reforming the filibuster, and what other pressures maybe the question asks that Biden and other Democrats can bring to bear on Senator Joe Manchin, especially in pushing for the Voting Rights Act, or HR 1.
Yeah, and I see that question is from a former student of mine. So hi,
Great.
John. I think that if you had to bet whether the filibuster is going to be abolished, it's a bad bet. But if it does happen, I don't think it's going to be surrounding HR 1. I think that the Democrats, maybe not Joe Biden, but Democrats, Chuck Schumer and company, would try to pick an issue that is more widely supported among the general public. And so something comes to mind might be universal background checks. Bring that to the Senate floor. It's got 90% support among the general public. And then, to see Republicans block that from even getting a vote might then, and Manchin actually is I believe, a supporter of universal background checks. And so if he could say, look, we tried to bring this up under the regular rules and it wasn't possible, that could give him an excuse to support something like reforming the filibuster. But there would have to be kind of a strategic steps like that with a popular bill that gets tried without, under the normal rules, and fails, and the public gets disgusted, and that gives political cover. That's how I would see it going. I know I'm not addressing the rest of John's question, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Peter, we have a Hunter alum and a retired Foreign Service officer in the audience asking a question or making a comment, but I'll try to turn that into a question. The statement essentially says that the ranks of the American Diplomatic Corps were essentially decimated during the last administration, and this has left the State Department with a younger team and lacking experience, and therefore, China is not getting the correct attention it needs. I guess I would say, how quickly can this be corrected? in terms of recruitment into the State Department. And as we focus more on domestic politics in this country, are we, I guess, producing enough right, future diplomats, and how can we do that?
I actually wonder whether Professor Brebo Wagner may have more to say on this than me. I think the Biden administration is, I think they does want to have a does want to reinvest in the State Department and have a kind of and they're trying to do some high profile things to try to improve morale and give some higher level jobs to career diplomats, a few fewer kind of ridiculous political appointees in top ambassadorships, and it's a competent and capable group. These are people who have one of the advantages the Democrats one of the advantages you have when you win presidential elections and when you have basically a good relationship between, you don't have huge ideological swings like you did with Trump, but you have a lot of continuity, is that you have the ability to kind of build people through the government system. So these Biden people now are people who were in the lower level in the Clinton administration, and then middle levels middle upper in the Biden administration. I mean, in the Obama administration, they have a lot of experience. So their competence and their professionalism isn't the issue. I think that to me, what worries me is there's not a lot of ideological diversity. And what you see is that, though, again, in contrast to domestic policy, when you have foreign policy appointees who even mildly veer outside of this consensus, particularly on China or, of course, on Israel, like Colin Kahl, for instance, who barely managed to get through the Senate confirmation, even though he's hardly radical at all, or Rob Malley, people who have any inclination to kind of step back and actually try to look at America in the way that non-Americans might look at America, right? Which is with a somewhat jaundiced eye towards the idea that we, have some inherent virtue in the way we interact with the rest of the world. You basically find very little tolerance for those people. It's very hard for them, I think. There are very few such people in the Biden administration.
So I think this question, even though addressed to Professor Beinart, I'm going to direct to Professor Brebo Wagner. And this is, the question reads, a frequent question that the Israeli government's representatives bring up is why focus on the Palestinians, where there are graver atrocities across the globe, like, and then listed Myanmar's Rohingya genocide, China's Uyghur camps, the war in Yemen, and the war in Syria. Professor Brebo Wagner, would you care to comment on that?
You're muted.
Jackie, you're muted. Jackie, you're muted.
I keep doing that. Right. I did want to just comment first on the State Department as the parent of a State Department person. The fact is, I do believe the department was decimated and that there were no hires, right? A lot of senior people obviously left during the Trump administration. But I do think that now there is a sense within the State Department that there is an appreciation for what they do with diplomacy, all right, and that although it is still early on, that we will see a better atmosphere, none of this deep state, right, atmosphere that created a lot of problems in the State Department in the last few years. The one thing I have to say is that despite this attention to diplomacy, I wonder how many people have read the CNN and so on reports which show that the diplomats in India, etc., and many places of the world have not been given access to COVID vaccines from the United States, and I know that has been an issue. So caring for those in headquarters is not the same as caring for those outside. So on the thing about on the Rohingya, I'm not quite sure what let's see, I have to go back. Could you repeat that question? which is about Rohingya and where is
I
it?
think the gist of the question is right there are human rights atrocities
Mm-hmm,
occurring all over the globe.
mm-hmm.
And why is there such a focus on the plight of the Palestinians?
Oh boy. I really do not think that we are not focusing on other issues as well. I think human rights is, something which, and under the Biden administration, is being prioritized. And I think that but the thing about the Palestinian issue is that it has been going on for so long. All right, it is time to wrap this up and to find a solution to this issue. I believe, and I can only, say that in visits to Jordan, for example, I think that I see among younger Palestinians a sort of patience is worn out. Their patience has been completely worn out with respect to whether this issue, which preoccupied their grandparents and so on and so forth, will ever be resolved. So I do think that just from the point of view of how long this has been an issue, that something has to be done. And it's not just on one side either. It is, the divisions between Hamas and the Palestinian, Authority and so on. Those kinds of things have to be resolved, and that it's just time. But I would disagree that we are not also paying attention to other situations, human rights abuses. And in fact, I think one of the ways in which that is being done is sanctions. We have upped our game a lot with respect to targeted sanctions, and there is an attempt to use that to try and resolve a number of situations around the world.
Could I just jump in with one sentence?
Sure,
on that?
go ahead.
I mean, the difference between Israel, Palestine, and Myanmar and Syria and Xinjiang is not that what's happening in Israel, Palestine is worse. It's that we're paying for it. That the U.S. gives $3 billion. Partially, the U.S. gives $3 billion in military aid to Israel a year. We don't. The other three countries are countries where we have some form of sanctions. So we're implicated in a different way.
Next question, I think is for Leslie, and it's about Biden and his extraordinary statements and actions in full support of the rights of workers to organize, which go well beyond the statements and conduct of prior presidents, including FDR. And so what are the implications of that, Leslie, for domestic policy? And I would even expand that and ask Professor Beiner to comment about the implications of strong unions on foreign policy.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I one of the things that let me sort of be a little bit more pessimistic now. One of the things that I should have said in response to the last question was that one of the areas that would very much help students and graduate students in particular is a universal healthcare policy. Now, we know that that there are some subsidies that were in the American Rescue Plan to enable people to take better advantage of the ACA. The premiums can be quite hard. These are subsidies for low-income people to access the ACA, and that has expanded some health insurance. And there is also there was also an open registration period that was a part of these plans as well, particularly the American Rescue Plan. So I think that's something that really has not been talked about very much, actually, is how to really create a universal healthcare program. Now, we know that this was one of the things that Biden opposed, sort of Medicare for all types of policies. But to me, this is a huge gap, particularly at this period with the coronavirus. And okay, so on the support for workers, I think so far these have been mainly discursive. This has mainly been narrative support. There is the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, that has passed the House. He is supportive of that. He has supported a panel, I think, to further study the development of or supporting collective bargaining. He has lifted the minimum wage for federal contract workers. So there are some concrete things that he's doing, but at this point, most of those have been mostly in word rather than in deed. Now that could be because there may not be the support to pass the PRO Act, for example, in the Senate. That may be one of the things that will be tested in the future. Again, I mean, in general, a lot of proposals are on the table. They have not been passed, however, and I would put workers' rights in that category.
Let's see what's that.
So Peter, could you comment about right the relationship between expanding workers' rights and expanding American jobs and how it might impact our relationship with China and how it relates to trade?
So I think unions are powerful enough in the Democratic Party, especially in tandem with the kind of rising kind of anti-globalization nationalism in the Republican Party, that they've been able to shut down the expansion of these free trade deals, most notably the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an absolute centerpiece of it stood at the very core of Obama's China policy. What's interesting is if you go back and you read many of the top Biden officials who are now making US-China policy during the Obama administration, what they say is, unless we get TPP and we basically have we are firmly in the middle of the rising economic order in Asia, none of this military stuff is really going to do much for us. But they lost TPP resoundingly. It has very little constituency in either party now. So they're trying to do the military stuff. That's why one recent commentator said the United States is at the risk of becoming the Hessians of Asia, which is essentially to say we're increasingly out of the economic game. And what we have mostly is a big military footprint. I think what's unfortunate is although the unions are powerful enough to stop these trade deals, they don't have enough influence to really begin to imagine a really different economic vision in which the United States might actually, rather than this becoming a kind of nationalist policy in which we try to basically decouple from China, we actually try to genuinely support Chinese workers. There are a couple of really interesting thinkers. I'd mentioned the works of Tabitha Chow and Jake Werner and the work they're doing here, talking about basically a new kind of globalization in which the United States and unions try to create, kind of linkages between people in essentially China's Rust Belt who are suffering their own form of outsourcing as capital moves, and basically tries to empower them by supporting labor unionization and strikes there, as opposed to basically this kind of nationalist vision of trying to protect American workers. But that's still, Elizabeth Warren and Sanders have kind of flirted with this, but right now it's still pretty marginal, unfortunately.
Thank you. David, I think I'm going to give you the last word and the last question here. And this is from also a former Hunter student. And remembering his classes at Hunter, he says, I still remember the early lectures at Hunter where civic responsibility and respect in the deepest sense were advocated, right, in terms of discourse on public policies and or public discourse. And what can we do to return to a nation of integrity is the question. I know you have thought and have written a lot about political polarization. And so, right, how can we become less polarized and maybe more respectful of each other?
Yeah, well, if I could answer that question. Yeah, I mean, polarization is that's the dominating political context that we're all living in, both outside and inside Washington. And I don't know that we do have a good answer for that. I think it's a good start having a president who's intentionally trying to turn the temperature down. You know, and I think most people, you ask most people, having a president that's not tweeting something inflammatory every day also is helpful. But in terms of moving forward and bridging gaps, I think just trying to frame politics in a way where we, you know, this won't be possible for every issue, and there are a lot of important issues we need to get to. That this is not, you know, a good strategy, but focusing on the things that we have in common. I think that's the strategy that Biden is attempting, and so we'll have a little bit of a taste of how effective that is. I'm not overly optimistic that there's a kumbaya moment at the end of the day, but I think that leadership from the top, that and the tone that's being set is helpful and can do a lot.
Thank you. I agree with that. I was put off a little bit by Tim Scott's opening remarks last night when he said President Biden seems to be a good guy, and you know, that seems to be the tone that that Biden was trying to get away from, and so hopefully, Republicans in the country will be more responsive to Biden's at least rhetorical outreach. So I want to thank all of the panelists for coming today. I want to thank everybody in the audience for coming as well and spending an hour with us on Thursday afternoon. And there'll be future programming coming, which I'm sure you'll be getting information on. And so have a good afternoon, and hope to see you soon.